The cold of the flagstones seeped through the thin soles of her slippers, a merciless chill that climbed her ankles and settled deep in her bones. Every shadow in the great hall felt alive, twisting like judgmental spirits in the flickering torchlight. Whispers followed her, sharp and cruel as burrs, catching on the worn fabric of her gray tunic. Broken, scarred, the half-blind Omega. They were not lies, and that was the cruelest part. The weight of the Moonstone Keep pressed down, a fortress built on strength and perfection, two things Isolde Valen had never known. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, tracing the cracks in the ancient stone, her one good eye watering from the smoke of the great fire pit. The other, a milky, sightless orb, saw only ghosts. Tonight, she felt certain she was about to become one. The Alpha King was waiting, and his silence was said to be more lethal than any blade. The guards shoved her forward, their contempt a palpable force against her back. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of brittle bone. She could smell them all, the assembled pack, the council of elders. Their scents were a symphony of power. Pine and damp earth from the warriors, dried herbs and parchment from the council, the cloying sweetness of the unmated females who lined the walls, their gazes a mixture of pity and relief that it was not them being presented. And beneath it all, the metallic tang of fear. Not just her own, but the entire pack's. They were afraid of the man on the throne. The throne sat empty, carved from the heartwood of a petrified ironwood tree. It was a monstrous, gnarled thing of black wood and polished stone. It seemed to absorb the light, radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. This was where King Auric Thornival sat, the alpha of alphas, the ruler of the northern clans, the man cursed by the moon goddess herself. Isolde was halted 10 paces from the dais, the guards stepping back as if a line had been drawn in the stone, a line no one dared cross. She trembled, wrapping her thin arms around herself, a futile gesture of protection. The fire scar that puckered the skin from her left temple down her neck and shoulder pulled tight, a constant burning reminder of the day her world was torn apart. The day she lost her sight, her beauty, and any hope of a future. Lord Kael, the king's most trusted advisor, stepped forward. His silver hair was braided with iron rings, his face a mask of grim duty. His scent was sharp, like frost on steel. "Isolde Valen," he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. He did not look at her, but at the empty throne. "Omega of the fallen Blackwood pack. Offered in tribute." A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. Tribute. They made it sound so noble. She was a burden, the last piece of a disgraced pack they were eager to be rid of. A flaw to be discarded. Every pack in the territory had been ordered to present their unmated females. A desperate, futile ritual to find a mate for the king, one whose proximity would not send him into agonizing torment. Dozens had been presented. Dozens had been sent away, weeping in terror or shame as the king choked on their scent, his skin blistering at the mere thought of their touch. The great doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. A hush fell, so absolute and sudden it was like a physical blow. The whispers died. The shifting of feet ceased. Even the fire seemed to crackle more softly. He entered not with a roar, but with the pressure of a coming storm. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the deep, cold fragrance of winter pine. King Auric Thornival was a giant of a man, built of the same harsh granite as the mountains that ringed his kingdom. His black hair was long, threaded with silver at the temples, and pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and brutal beauty. A thick, dark beard framed a mouth set in a permanent line of grim endurance. Scars mapped his skin, a pale white line that cut through his left eyebrow, another that disappeared beneath the high collar of his black leather tunic. But they were marks of battle, not of weakness. They were symbols of his power, of the wars he had won and the enemies he had crushed. But it was his eyes that held the curse. They glowed with a faint silvery light, the mark of a direct descendant of the moon's first wolf. Yet they were filled with a pain so ancient, so profound, it seemed to eclipse the very light they emitted. He moved with a coiled, predatory grace, each step a testament to the power he kept leashed with iron control. The pack lowered their heads as he passed, a wave of submission rippling through the hall. Isolde could not breathe. Her scarred skin tingled, not with fear, but with something else, an awareness. The air around him was an electric field, a warning and a lure all at once. He ascended the dais and settled into the throne, the dark wood groaning under his weight. For a long moment he did not look at her. His gaze swept over the hall, a silent assertion of his dominance, his suffering, his solitude. Finally, his silver eyes fell upon her. She flinched, expecting the disgust, the immediate dismissal. She waited for him to clutch his chest, to rasp for air, for the curse to manifest. It was what always happened. The scent of a female was poison to him. But the king remained perfectly still. He did not choke. He did not recoil. His massive chest rose and fell in a steady, even rhythm. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle. Isolde risked a glance up through the curtain of her lank brown hair. His eyes were narrowed, his focus absolute. He was studying her. A low sound rumbled in his chest, too deep to be human. It was the sound of his wolf, a creature spoken of in hushed, terrified whispers. A beast of unparalleled rage, chained by the king's curse. Lord Kyle cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. "My king, shall we remove her?" Auric Thorneval did not answer. He leaned forward slightly, his huge hands gripping the arms of his throne. The leather creaked in protest. He inhaled a deep, deliberate breath that made Isolde's blood run cold. She smelled of ash and sorrow, of the salves she used on her burns, of the rain that had soaked her thin cloak on the journey here. There was nothing of the floral, fertile scent of the other unmated females. She was a barren field, a smoldering ruin. He should be choking. He should be in agony. He was not. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The silvery light in his eyes intensified, and Isolde felt his gaze not on her skin, but beneath it. It was as if he could see the shivering, pathetic thing that was her wolf, curled up and hiding in the depths of her soul. He saw her brokenness, her shame, her utter lack of worth. And still he watched her, still he breathed. A murmur rippled through the assembled pack. They saw it too. The king was not reacting. The curse, for the first time in 2 decades, was dormant. What was this witchery? Was the Omega so broken, so devoid of a female essence, that the curse did not even recognize her? The whispers started again, this time edged with suspicion and a new kind of fear. "Bring her closer," the king commanded. His voice was a revelation. It was not the shout of a warrior or the clipped command of a ruler. It was a low, gravelly rumble, rough as stones grinding together, resonant with a pain that had scraped it raw. It was a voice that had not been used for conversation in years, and the sound of it shocked the court into another stunned silence. Lord Kale hesitated, his eyes wide. "My king, are you certain? The proximity." "Closer," Auric repeated, and this time the order was laced with the steel of an alpha's command. It was not a request. The guards flinched and grabbed Isolde's arms, their grips painfully tight. They dragged her forward, across the invisible line, onto the first step of the dais. She stumbled, her knees hitting the cold stone with a sharp crack. She was now so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of contained power. The scent of pine and ozone was overwhelming, making her head spin. It was a scent that should have terrified her, the scent of an apex predator, but strangely, it settled something deep inside her. It quieted the frantic bird in her chest. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling to hide the scarred side of her face. She could hear his breathing now. It was deep, measured, and for the first time in his adult life, untainted by pain. The entire hall held its breath with him. She felt, more than saw, him rise from his throne. A shadow fell over her, vast and consuming. He stood before her, a mountain of a man cloaked in silence and sorrow. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the blow, for the snarled dismissal, for the final, ultimate rejection that would surely break what little was left of her. A large, calloused hand entered her field of vision. It was scarred and powerful, the hand of a king and a killer. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the very air between them. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her entire body went rigid. His fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed against the curtain of her hair. He swept it aside, exposing the ruined landscape of her skin, the puckered, discolored flesh, the milky, blind eye. He exposed her shame to the entire court. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Isolde waited for him to recoil. He did not. His thumb ghosted over the edge of her scar, a touch so light it was barely there. It did not burn him. It did not sear his skin. She felt a tremor run through his hand, a minute vibration of shock and disbelief. Then he spoke again, his voice a ragged whisper meant for her alone, yet it carried in the dead silence like a thunderclap. "Stay." The word hung in the air, a single impossible anchor in a sea of suffocating silence. Stay. It was not a word Isolde was accustomed to hearing with any meaning beyond servitude. Stay and clean the hearth. Stay out of sight. But the way he had said it, a low, ragged command from the depths of his chest, had felt less like an order and more like a plea. A drowning man finding a piece of driftwood. The silence shattered. A wave of murmurs, sharp and venomous, crashed against the dais. They were the sounds of disbelief turning to suspicion. Blasphemy, trickery. A broken omega, a thing of ash and ruin, had somehow defied a curse laid by the goddess herself. Their fear, once directed solely at their king, now found a new target. Her. Lord Cale stepped forward, his face pale, his composure cracking. "Your Majesty, this is unwise. The girl could be a danger, some unknown witchery." Auric Thorneval didn't even look at his advisor. He raised a hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of a mountain collapsing. The murmurs died instantly. The air grew thin again, charged with the unassailable authority of the Alpha King. His silver eyes, which had never left Isolde's face, held a raw, bewildered intensity. He was seeing more than her scars, more than her milky, sightless eye. He was looking into her, peeling back the layers of shame and pain, as if searching for an answer he desperately needed. "Dismissed." Auric's voice was a low growl that vibrated through the stone floor. "All of you." The command was absolute. There was no hesitation, no questioning. The pack, from the lowest Omega to the highest-ranking warriors of his guard, turned as one. They filed out of the great hall, a river of resentment and confusion, their backward glances like stones thrown at Isolde's back. She remained on her knees, the focal point of a storm she could not comprehend, trapped in the orbit of the king's silent disbelief. Lord Cale was the last to leave. He paused at the edge of the dais, his gaze hard and full of warning. "Be cautious, my king," he murmured, his loyalty warring with his fear. "An anomaly is not a cure." Then he too was gone, and the great oak doors boomed shut, sealing them inside. Silence descended once more, but this was different. It was not the tense public silence of the court, but something more profound, more intimate. It was the silence of two solitudes colliding. The great hall, moments before teeming with life, now felt like a vast, empty tomb, lit only by the sputtering torches and the hungry fire in the central pit. The king finally moved. He withdrew his hand, and the absence of his touch was a sudden, sharp cold against her skin. He took a step back, his boots scuffing on the stone. He was breathing, deeply. His chest rose and fell in powerful, even waves. Isolde watched, mesmerized. She had heard the stories of the king's strangled gasps, the choked, tearing sounds he made in the presence of any female, his body rejecting their very essence. But now he breathed her in as if she were clean mountain air. He paced before the throne, a great caged wolf. The tightly coiled control she had sensed earlier was fraying at the edges. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his knuckles white. He was a man confronting the impossible, the foundation of his cursed existence cracking beneath his feet. "Your name," he said, the words rough, as if dragged from a place of disuse. Isolde swallowed, her throat dry as dust. Her own voice felt like a stranger to her. "Isolde Valen, your Majesty." It came out as a whisper, thin and reedy. "Valen," he repeated, the name a strange shape in his mouth. He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "Of the Blackwood Pack." It was not a question. He knew, of course he knew. He knew she was the last remnant of a pack that had been decimated for practicing forbidden blood magic, a stain on the honor of the northern clans. She flinched, expecting the accusation, the condemnation. She lowered her head, the curtain of her hair falling to hide her face again. "Yes, my king." Look at me. The command was soft, yet it pierced through her defenses. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her chin. Her one good eye met his glowing silver gaze. The sheer force of his attention was terrifying. No one ever truly looked at her. They looked at her scars, at her blindness, at her shame. He looked at her. They said you were broken, he stated, his voice devoid of judgment. A simple observation. Scarred by fire. Half blind. It is the truth, she whispered, her hands clenching into fists in her lap. What is your scent? He asked, his head tilted. I smell the smoke that scarred you. I smell the winter rain on your cloak. I smell tab, but there is nothing else. Nothing of the poison. She had no answer. She had always been this way. After the fire, when her childhood had been burned away, her scent had changed. The other omegas blossomed with the sweet, fertile scents of clover and honey, attracting mates and starting families. Isolde smelled only of what had been lost, of embers and sorrow. It was one more mark of her otherness, her failure. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was towering over her again. He knelt. The king of the northern clans, the alpha of alphas, knelt on the cold stone before a broken omega. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly unbelievable, that Isolde's mind simply refused to process it. Give me your hand, he said, his voice now quiet, urgent. Her body moved without her consent. Trembling violently, she extended her hand, palm up. It was a small, pale thing, marred by faint scars of its own. He looked at it for a long moment before his own hand, large and dark and calloused, covered hers. She braced for pain, for him. She expected him to cry out, to have his skin blister and burn. A jolt went through her, sharp and electric, but it was not pain. It was warmth. A deep, resonant heat that started in their joined hands and spread up her arm like liquid fire, chasing away the bone-deep chill that had been her constant companion for years. It pooled in her chest, a sun rising in a land of perpetual twilight. Arik sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes slammed shut, and a shudder racked his massive frame. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers, a desperate, anchoring grip. His face, for a fleeting second, lost its grim mask of endurance. The lines of pain eased, and in their place was a look of profound, agonizing relief. It was the face of a man who had been starving for a lifetime, and was finally given a crust of bread. The warmth intensified, and with it came a strange thrumming, a vibration that seemed to sing along her very bones. It was coming from him, a deep primal resonance that her own dormant wolf stirred in response to. For the first time in a decade, she felt it, that other self, so long cowed into submission. Lifting its head from the shadows of her soul, sniffing the air with a dawning curiosity. He opened his eyes. The silver in them was brighter now, molten and swirling with an emotion she could not name. He stared at their joined hands, and his breath hitched. Following his gaze, Isolde saw it. A faint ethereal wisp of silver light, no thicker than a thread, was uncoiling from his skin and wrapping around their clasped hands. It pulsed with a soft, gentle rhythm, in time with the thrumming she felt in her blood. It was beautiful and terrifying. It was magic. Not the dark, forbidden magic of her ancestors, but something purer, older, something of the moon herself. The sight broke his control. With a low, guttural growl, he snatched his hand back as if he had been burned after all. The warmth vanished. The light died. The cold rushed back in, more biting than before. He surged to his feet, backing away from her, his chest heaving. The agony was back in his eyes, but it was a different kind now, It was not the pain of the curse, but the torment of a revelation too vast to comprehend. His wolf was close to the surface, a barely contained cataclysm. "What have they done?" he snarled. The words directed at the empty hall, at the ghosts of her disgraced ancestors, at the goddess who had cursed him. He looked down at his own hand, then back at her, his expression a maelstrom of shock, fury, and a terrifying dawning hope. He strode towards her, his purpose absolute. He did not stop until he was standing over her again, his shadow swallowing her completely. He reached down, his hands closing on her upper arms, and lifted her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. The contact was electric, overwhelming. Her head spun, the scents of pine and ozone and his unique personal musk flooding her senses, short-circuiting her thoughts. His grip was iron, yet it didn't hurt. He held her there, his silver eyes boring into hers, searching, demanding. The rage in his features warred with a desperate vulnerability. He was the most powerful being she had ever encountered, and in that moment, he was also the most lost. "What are you?" he breathed, the question a ragged tear in the fabric of the silence. It was not an accusation of witchery, but a desperate, soul-deep inquiry. He wasn't asking what she was, but who she was to him. And in the depths of his luminous, cursed eyes, Isolde saw the terrifying, impossible answer beginning to dawn. The question was a chasm opening at her feet. What are you? Her mind was a whirlwind of ash and echoes, offering no answer. She was Isolde. She was broken. She was the last ember of a dead fire. These were not answers, but condemnations. She could not speak. The force of his presence, the raw, searching power in his silver eyes, had stolen the air from her lungs. His hands on her arms were not just holding her, they were anchoring her to a reality that was shifting and fracturing with every beat of her heart. Deep within her, the timid, sleeping creature that was her wolf stirred again. It wasn't the fierce, proud beast of an alpha, or even the steady presence of a normal pack wolf. Hers was a thing of shadow and fear, accustomed to hiding. But now it lifted its head, not in terror, but in recognition. A low, unfamiliar hum started in her blood, a resonance that answered the coiled power in him. He saw the confusion, the fear, the utter lack of comprehension in her face. His jaw tightened, the frustration of a lifetime of unanswered prayers warring with the fragile, impossible hope she represented. He was a king accustomed to answers, to absolutes, to the clear lines of battle and law. She was a paradox he could not solve, a whisper against the roaring curse that had defined his existence. With a growl that was pure frustration, he made a decision. He released one of her arms, and before she could process the movement, he swept his other arm behind her back, another under her knees, and lifted her from the floor. A startled gasp escaped her lips. The world tilted, the stone floor dropping away, the torchlight spinning. She was suddenly cradled against his chest, her head tucked just below his shoulder. The shock of it was so absolute it momentarily erased all fear. She was weightless, held effortlessly in the grip of a predator. The scent of him was overwhelming now, pine, cold air, and something else. A dark, musky scent of wolf and soil that was intoxicatingly primal. The hard planes of his chest were a wall of muscle beneath her cheek, and she could hear it, feel it vibrating through her entire body. The steady, powerful, uninterrupted beat of his heart. He turned and strode from the dais, carrying her as if she were a precious, fragile discovery. He moved with a long, purposeful gait, his boots echoing in the vast emptiness of the hall. He was not taking her to the dungeons, nor was he casting her out into the cold. He bypassed the main corridors and entered a private passage hidden behind a heavy tapestry, depicting a great white wolf howling at a silver moon. The air grew cooler as they moved through the stone passage, lit by sconces set far apart. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the soft rustle of her worn tunic against his leather armor. Isolde lay perfectly still in his arms, her mind reeling. This was madness. This was a dream from which she would wake cold and alone in her cot. Yet the strength of his arms, the solid reality of his heartbeat against her ear, was undeniable. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being steadily crowded out by a profound, terrifying curiosity. He stopped before a door of iron-banded oak and pushed it open with his shoulder. He carried her inside and kicked it shut behind them. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding home was a note of finality. He was in his private chambers. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was the heart of his solitude, the epicenter of his curse. The room was vast and Spartan. A massive bed, draped in black furs, sat against one wall. A hearth, large enough to roast an ox, was cold and black, filled with old ashes. Books were piled on a heavy wooden table, their pages filled with ancient scripts, diagrams of constellations, and treatises on curses and bloodlines. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint metallic scent of his solitude. It was the room of a king, but it felt like the cell of a prisoner. He did not take her to the bed. He crossed to the center of the room, to the thick bear pelt rug that lay before the cold fireplace. And gently, so gently it made her ache, he set her on her feet. He did not release her immediately, his hands lingering on her arms, as if to assure himself she was real. "The curse," he said, his voice a low rasp in the quiet room. "Since I was a boy. The moon's judgment on my bloodline. Any female of shifting age. Their scent is a fire in my lungs. Their touch, a brand." He finally let her go and took a step back. His hands clenched at his sides. He watched her, his silver eyes blazing in the dim light. "But you are quiet. The fire does not come. The brand does not sear." Isolde hugged herself, the chill of the room seeping into her again now that he was not touching her. I do not know why." He took another step back, pacing like the caged wolf she'd seen in the hall. He stopped at the table and braced his hands on its surface, his head bowed, the muscles in his back cording with tension. "For 20 years, I have not known a moment's peace. My wolf rages against the bars of this curse, a constant torment. To be an alpha who cannot stand his own pack, who cannot seek a mate, it is a living death." He looked up, his gaze pinning her from across the room. "And then you kneel before my throne, and for the first time since I was a child, I can breathe." The raw agony in his voice was a physical thing. It reached across the space between them and clutched at her heart. She saw past the king, past the feared alpha, and saw the man. A man drowning in a silence no one else could enter. Slowly, deliberately, he walked back to her. He did not stop until mere inches separated them. He was searching for proof, for a sign that this was not some elaborate hallucination. He lifted his hand again, the same scarred, powerful hand from the hall. He moved with an excruciating slowness, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the floor, held fast by the invisible currents that flowed between them. His fingers, hesitant and trembling with a restraint that must have cost him everything, came to rest on her face. He cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the unmarred skin of her right cheek. The touch was electric. The warmth bloomed again, chasing the cold from her veins. It was a gentle, questioning touch, full of a decade's worth of starved tenderness. His eyes closed, a shudder passing through him. A low sound, half growl, half groan of relief, escaped his lips. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, moved to her chin, and then, with infinite care, traveled upwards to the scarred landscape on the left side of her face. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. His thumb ghosted over the puckered, ruined skin, over the sealed lid of her blind eye, with a reverence that stole her breath. He was not touching a flaw. He was touching a part of her. He was touching her pain. Tears welled in her good eye, blurring his formidable face into a haze of shadow and silver light. No one had touched her scars with anything but revulsion. He touched them as if they were sacred. And then she did something she never could have predicted. Some new brave instinct, born of his gentleness, rose up within her. As his hand cradled the side of her face, she slowly lifted her own, her movements clumsy and uncertain. She laid her small, trembling hand over his. The moment her skin met his, the room changed. The silver light she had seen in the hall bloomed into existence again, but this time it was not a mere thread. It was a soft, luminous aura that engulfed their joined hands, pulsing with the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, a silent, magical testament to the impossible connection between them. Arik's eyes flew open. He stared at their hands, bathed in the gentle, lunar glow, and a look of pure, unadulterated awe transformed his harsh features. The king, the warrior, the cursed ruler, all of it fell away, leaving only a man witnessing a miracle. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered on the chamber door. The light vanished, the moment shattered. Arik's head snapped up, the mask of the Alpha King slamming back into place. His body went rigid, and he instinctively stepped in front of Isolde, shielding her with his bulk. His hand, which had been so gentle, fell away. "Enter," he growled, the single word a threat. The door opened and Lord Kael swept in, his face a thunderous mask of disapproval. He stopped short, his gaze taking in the scene, the king standing defensively before the broken Omega, the charged intimacy that still hung heavy in the air of the royal chambers. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and fury. My king, the council is in an uproar, Kael said, his voice tight with controlled rage. They demand the girl be removed. They speak of witchcraft, of a blackwood curse meant to trick the eye and poison the bloodline. She must be handed over to the seers for questioning. Isolde shrank back, the old familiar fear returning like a flood tide. The seers, their questioning was a thing of legend, brutal, invasive, and often not fatal. Auric did not turn to look at her. He kept his back to her, a solid wall between her and the threat his advisor represented. The council will be silent, Auric said, his voice dangerously low. They will do nothing. You cannot be serious, Kael exclaimed, taking a step forward. Auric, this thing has bewitched you. For all we know, her touch is a slow poison, an illusion that will cost you your life, and the kingdom its future. She is the first breath of clean air I have taken in 2 decades, Auric snarled, turning his head just enough that the silvery glow of his eyes fell on Kael like a physical weight. You will not touch her. The council will not touch her. No one will touch her. He took a half-step back, his arm moving to bar Isolde from Kael's sight entirely. He felt her trembling behind him. Without thinking, without planning, his hand found hers in the space between them, his fingers lacing through her own in a gesture of silent, defiant possession. Lord Kael stared, his mouth agape, at their joined hands, at the lack of pain on his king's face, at the fierce protective fire that burned there instead. She stays, Auric Thorneval declared, his voice ringing with the unshakable power of the Alpha King, a vow made to the room, to his pack, and to the silent, watching moon. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a binding claim. She is mine. The words echoed in the stone chamber long after Lord Kael had gone, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief and grudging submission. She is mine. They were not words of love or tenderness, but of possession, a claim staked with the raw, undeniable authority of an alpha. Isolde stood frozen behind the solid wall of Auric's back, his hand still laced with hers, a lifeline in a storm. The warmth from his grip was a stark contrast to the icy dread that Kael's accusations had poured into her veins. Witchcraft, poison, the seers. The old fears were sharp and familiar, the ghosts of her ancestors rising to whisper their condemnations in her ear. Auric did not release her. He stood listening to Kael's retreating footsteps fade down the stone corridor. Only when the heavy sound of a distant door closing reached them did the tension in his shoulders ease. He let out a slow, measured breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He turned, his body shielding her from the door, his silver eyes searching her face. He saw the terror there, the way she flinched at every shadow. He will not harm you, Auric said, his voice a low rumble. It was a promise, absolute and final. He drew her away from the door, leading her further into the heart of his sanctuary. He released her hand only to guide her toward a heavy carved wooden chair near the cold hearth. Sit. She obeyed, sinking into the chair, her legs too weak to hold her. He remained standing, a restless energy radiating from him. The king, who had been a statue for decades, was now a creature of constant motion. He paced before the fire, his mind clearly racing, grappling with the political and spiritual upheaval her presence represented. Kael is loyal, he said, more to himself than to her, but his loyalty is to the throne, to the bloodline. He sees you as a threat to both. The council will be the same. They fear what they do not understand. He stopped and looked at her, his expression grim. They will try to take you from me. The simple statement sent a fresh wave of fear through her. To the seers? She whispered, the words tasting of ash. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. Over my dead body. He walked to the cold hearth, and with a startling burst of strength, seized a massive iron poker and struck the stone mantle. Sparks flew. The clang of metal on stone was a violent, percussive sound, a physical manifestation of his rage. For 20 years, they have offered me nothing but platitudes and pity. They have watched my kingdom stagnate, whispering behind their hands about the cursed king who will die without an heir. Now the moon sends me this. He gestured toward her, his hand open, a gesture of both frustration and wonder. A key, an answer. And they want to cast it into the fire because it does not fit the lock they were expecting. He was a storm contained in the body of a man. The sheer force of his emotion was terrifying, and, in a strange way, exhilarating. No one had ever felt so fiercely on her behalf. She had only ever been a thing to be discarded, ignored, or pitied. To be the object of such potent, protective fury was a dizzying, unfamiliar sensation. It made the timid wolf within her peer out from the shadows with a dawning boldness. He finally seemed to gain control of his rage, his breathing evening out. He leaned the poker back against the hearth and turned to the large table, lighting a series of thick tallow candles. The room was cast in a warm, flickering glow, softening the harsh lines of the stone and wood. He moved to a heavy wooden chest in the corner and pulled out a thick fur blanket, woven from the pelts of shadow wolves, black and impossibly soft. He walked to her and draped it around her shoulders. The fur was heavy and smelled faintly of him, of pine and cold night air. The warmth was immediate and profound, a shield against the room's chill and the fear in her heart. His fingers brushed the side of her neck as he adjusted the blanket, and the brief, accidental contact sent a jolt of heat straight through her. She saw his hand tremble slightly before he pulled it away. "You are cold," he stated simply. She could only nod. Clutching the edges of the fur, he looked at the empty hearth, then back at her. A decision seemed to pass over his face. He knelt before her again, bringing them eye to eye. His proximity was still overwhelming, but the terror was being replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. "I must understand this," he said, his voice low and intense. "I need you to tell me everything. The fire, your family. Do not hide the parts you believe to be shameful. Shame has no place in this room." The request was a gentle command, but it asked for more than he could know. It asked for the key to a locked room within her soul, a place of pain she had not revisited in years. But the honest, searching need in his silver eyes was impossible to deny. He had shown her the depths of his own cursed solitude. How could she deny him her own? So she spoke. Her voice was hesitant at first, a rusty key in a lock. She told him of the Blackwood Pack, a small, isolated clan that had always dabbled in the old ways, walking the fine line between moon worship and the darker, earthier magic that the other packs had long since abandoned. She spoke of her parents, of their desperation for power, for a way to elevate their status. They were trying to bind a spirit, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle flames. A spirit of the deep woods. They believed it would grant them insight, make our pack stronger. They used a blood ritual. Auric listened without interruption, his face unreadable stone. "I was a child. I didn't understand. I followed them to the ritual circle. Something went wrong. The spirit they summoned. It was not what they expected. It was a thing of rage and fire." Her hand instinctively went to the scar on her face. There was an explosion of energy, of heat. "I remember the smell of burning pine. And the screaming." She trailed off, the memories of physical weight in her chest. She had never spoken of this to anyone. The survivors of her pack had been scattered, their history rewritten as a cautionary tale of blasphemy. She had simply been the scarred, half-blind remnant, a living symbol of their disgrace. "That was when you were changed," Auric prompted gently. She nodded, pulling the fur tighter around her. "My sight in that eye was gone. The healer said the fire had burned something away inside me, too. My scent. It was gone, replaced by the smell of ash. They said my wolf was damaged, that I would likely be barren, a broken vessel." The words were bitter on her tongue, the insults of a dozen packs she had been fostered with over the years. She finally risked a look at him. She expected to see what she always saw: disgust, pity, or the cold judgment of a pious wolf. Instead, his silver eyes held a fierce, focused concentration. He was not judging her past. He was dissecting it, searching for a clue. "Barren," he murmured, the word a stone dropped into a deep well. He looked from her face to her hands, then back again. "The curse of my line was laid by the moon goddess upon my ancestor, the first king. He betrayed his mate, and in her grief, she prayed for a vengeance that would echo through his bloodline. The goddess heard. She decreed that no fertile female, no wolf capable of carrying the next generation, would ever bring him comfort. Their very essence, the scent of life, would be a poison to him and all the sons of his line." He leaned closer, the silver in his eyes seeming to glow with dawning comprehension. "Isolde, the fire did not break you." Her breath caught. "It purified you," he whispered. a note of awe in his voice. It burned away the one thing the curse was designed to attack. The scent of fertility, what they called barrenness, what they called broken, might be the very thing that makes you the exception. The loophole in a goddess's rage. The idea was so staggering, so world-altering, that Isolde could not absorb it. Her flaw, her shame, her lifelong mark of worthlessness, could it truly be her salvation? The key to a king's curse? It was too much. The room seemed to tilt, the candlelight swimming before her good eye. Arik saw the overwhelming shock on her face. He reached out, his hands closing on her shoulders, grounding her. "Breathe," he commanded softly, his touch. It was still a miracle. The gentle warmth spread from his hands, steadying her, pushing back the dizzying vertigo. The thrumming started in her blood again. A quiet song answering his. Her wolf, which had cowered from the memory of the fire, now seemed to press forward, drawn to the strength and certainty in his touch. It recognized him not as a threat, but as something else, something it had waited for. "My king," she stammered, her mind struggling to form words. "If this is true, what does it mean?" "It means the whispers of the council are wrong," he said, his grip tightening slightly, his voice filled with a conviction that was as solid as the stone walls around them. "This is not witchcraft. This is not a trick. This is the moon's own judgment, finally turning in our favor. It means—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with curses or politics. It was ancient, primal, and utterly new to them both. He had been starved of touch, of simple proximity, for his entire adult life. She had been starved of acceptance, of kindness, of any touch that was not meant to push her away. He leaned in, his face now inches from hers. She could see the flecks of charcoal and silver in his irises, the deep lines of pain etched around his eyes. She could smell the clean, cold scent of his skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild, frantic drumbeat. He was going to kiss her. The thought was both terrifying and exquisitely desirable. Her good eye fluttered shut. She felt his breath, warm against her lips. She waited, and then he pulled back. A low, pained growl tore from his chest. He released her and surged to his feet, turning his back on her. He stalked to the far side of the room, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of extreme agitation. "I cannot," he bit out, his back still to her. "This is too much, too fast, to have spent a lifetime in a desert and then be offered an ocean. I will drown." Isolde sat clutching the furs, her body trembling with the aftershock of the moment. Rejection. It was a familiar sting, but this was different. He had not pushed her away in disgust. He had pulled back in fear. Not fear of her, but fear for himself. Fear of the overwhelming flood of sensation, of emotion, of a hope so powerful it threatened to shatter the careful control that had kept him sane for 20 years. He turned to face her, his expression tormented. "You will be safe here. No one will enter these chambers without my permission. I will have food and clothes brought. You will want for nothing." His voice was formal now, the king reasserting himself over the man. But then his eyes met hers, and the facade cracked. The raw need, the desperate hope, the terror, it was all there, laid bare for her to see. "I need to think," he said, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. "I need to walk under the open sky and not feel as though the world is ending and beginning all at once." He strode to the door, his movements stiff and controlled. He paused with his hand on the iron latch, his back to her. "Do not be afraid, Isolde," he murmured without turning around. "For the first time in my life, I am the one who is terrified." Then he was gone, the heavy door closing behind him, with a soft final click, leaving her alone with the flickering candles, the scent of him on the fur around her shoulders, and the ghost of a kiss that had almost been. Isolde remained in the king's chair for a long time after he left, wrapped in the heavy black fur, a lone island in the vast, silent sea of his chambers. The world had tilted on its axis. Everything she had known about herself, her brokenness, her worthlessness, had been shattered and reformed into something terrifying and new. Purified. The word echoed in her mind. A flaw had become a key, a curse had become a blessing, and the king, a figure of myth and fear, had become a man of flesh and blood, a man whose tormented soul had reached out and recognized her own. A soft knock came at a smaller secondary door she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows near the great bed. She froze, clutching the fur, her heart leaping into her throat. Had Kyle disobeyed? Were the seers coming for her? "My lady," a quiet, elderly voice called. "The king has sent me. I am Alara. I am to see to your needs." Slowly, Isolde rose. She crossed the room and hesitated before sliding the bolt. An old woman with a face like a kindly, wrinkled apple and kind, clever eyes stood there, holding a tray laden with food and a bundle of clean clothes. Her scent was muted, like dried herbs and wood smoke, the scent of an elder well past her childbearing years, and therefore no threat to the king's curse. Alara's gaze was curious, but not unkind. It swept over Isolde, taking in the scarred face, the worn tunic, and the priceless shadow wolf fur draped around her shoulders. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second at the sight of the fur, a clear mark of the king's favor, before her expression settled back into one of serene professionalism. "King Auric commanded that you be given the finest hospitality, my lady," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "He was most particular." Alara led her to a bathing chamber adjoining the king's rooms, a space of steam-warmed stone and a deep copper tub. As Isolde soaked in the blessedly hot water, scrubbing away the grime of her journey and the scent of fear, she felt as if she were shedding an old skin. The clothes Alara had brought were simple but finely made of soft, dark blue wool, a world away from the scratchy omega gray she had worn her entire life. For the first time, she did not feel like a burden or a piece of tribute. She felt like a guest, an honored one. Later, sitting by the now roaring fire that Alara had expertly coaxed to life, eating warm bread and savory stew, Isolde began to truly process the magnitude of what was happening. The king had not rejected her. He had retreated, overwhelmed. He had claimed her, not as a mate in the traditional sense, but as his, a discovery, a secret, a hope. The wolf inside her, so long silent, was awake now. It paced the edges of her consciousness, not with fear, but with a restless, humming energy. It felt the alpha's claim, not as a cage, but as a shield. It recognized his scent, which seemed to linger in the very stones of the room, as a scent of safety, of home. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting silvery light through the high, narrow windows of the chamber. Isolde found she could not sleep. She paced the room, just as he had, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She ran her fingers over the spines of his books, tracing the strange ancient runes. She stood before the massive bed with its black furs and imagined the lonely, agonizing nights he must have spent there. This room was not a home. It was a fortress built against the world, and she was the first person to ever be invited inside. A sudden, sharp howl cut through the night. It was not the call of a common wolf. This was a sound of pure, untamed power, of agony and rage-given voice. It was a sound that shook the very foundations of the keep, a primal scream directed at the heavens. It was him. It was his wolf. Isolde rushed to the window, her heart pounding. Far below, in the central courtyard of the keep, she saw him. He had stripped to the waist despite the biting cold, his magnificent torso a roadmap of scars under the stark moonlight. He was on his knees, his head thrown back, his body corded with tension as another of those soul-shattering howls ripped from his throat. The pack was gathering. Warriors, elders, females. They poured into the courtyard, drawn by the alpha's distress. They kept their distance, forming a wide, fearful circle around him. They did not dare approach. They could only watch as their king, their invincible leader, was torn apart by a force they could not see. Isolde knew what was happening. He was fighting his wolf. He was fighting the overwhelming primal urge that her presence had awakened. The need to claim, to possess, to mate, instincts that had been suppressed by his curse for 20 years, were now roaring to the surface, demanding release. And he was denying them, afraid of the very power that she had unleashed. Lord Kyle was there, his face grim, trying to reason with him from a safe distance. But Auric was beyond words. He was in the grip of his own raw nature. He slammed his fists against the frozen earth, his knuckles splitting, his growls turning into guttural roars of pain. Then the moon changed. The pure silver light began to deepen, taking on a reddish, bloody hue. The bleeding moon. A rare celestial event. It was considered a powerful omen, a time when the veil between the spirit world and the physical world was thin, when prophecies could be fulfilled and curses could be broken or strengthened. As the crimson light washed over him, Aric's body began to contort. A new sound tore from him, a sound of snapping bone and tearing flesh. He was shifting, not the controlled fluid shift of a normal wolf, but a violent, agonizing transformation. His wolf, driven mad by decades of suppression and now supercharged by her proximity and the power of the bleeding moon, was trying to force its way out. Panic seized the pack. A forced shift of an alpha of his power could be catastrophic. It could kill him. Isolde didn't think. She only acted. The sight of his agony was a physical blow, a pain that echoed deep in her own soul. Her quiet, timid wolf rose up with a fierce, protective snarl she didn't know it possessed. It screamed at her to go to him, to soothe him, to answer his call. She threw open the door to his chambers and ran. She flew down the empty stone corridors, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. Guards tried to stop her, their eyes wide with alarm, but she dodged them, fueled by a desperate, instinctual need. She burst into the courtyard. The pack turned as one, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. Growls rumbled through the crowd. "Keep her back," Lord Kyle roared, stepping in her path. "You have done enough damage, witch!" "Let me pass," Isolde said, and she was shocked by the strength in her own voice. It did not waver. "I can help him." "You will kill him!" But Auric had heard her. His head, half transformed, still more man than beast, but covered in sprouting black fur, snapped in her direction. His eyes, now glowing with a furious, feral crimson light, locked onto hers. A low, desperate whine escaped his throat. It was a sound of recognition, a plea. Isolde pushed past Kyle, ignoring the snarls and threats of the pack. She walked into the circle of fear, her every step an act of defiance. The cold of the courtyard stones bit at her feet, but she barely felt it. Her entire being was focused on the kneeling, broken figure at the center. She stopped a few feet from him. He was a terrifying sight, caught between man and wolf, his body a war zone. Blood trickled from his split knuckles and from his lips where he had bitten them. "Auric," she whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden, tense silence. His head lowered, his breathing coming in harsh, ragged pants. The crimson light in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. He was fighting. He was trying to hold on to his humanity for her. She took another step, and then another until she was standing directly before him. She ignored the horrified gasps of the pack. She ignored the instinct for self-preservation that screamed at her to run. She knelt in the frozen dirt before him, bringing herself to his level. Slowly she reached out her hand. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice trembling but steady. "I am here. Breathe with me." Her fingers touched his face. His skin was fever-hot, his sprouting fur coarse. The moment of contact was a lightning strike. The world seemed to explode in a flash of silver and crimson light. An incredible power surged from him into her, and from her into him, a closed circuit of impossible energy. It did not hurt. It felt like coming home, like two halves of a shattered whole clicking back into place. Auric let out a shuddering groan, the sound less animal and more human. The violent contortions of his body began to subside. The dark fur receded. The sharp angles of his face softened, the bones seeming to slide back into their proper places. He was still fighting, but now he was not fighting alone. Her presence, her touch, was an anchor in the storm of his transformation. She moved her hand from his cheek to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp hair. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. It was an act of profound intimacy, a gesture of submission and dominance all at once, performed in front of his entire pack. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the act of a witch. This was the act of a mate. Under the light of the bleeding moon, surrounded by his stunned pack, King Auric Thornival stopped shaking. The feral crimson light faded from his eyes, leaving only the soft, familiar silver. He was breathing, deeply. His chest rose and fell, his forehead still pressed against hers. He was exhausted, bleeding, and trembling with the aftershock, but he was whole. He was human. He lifted his head, his eyes locking with hers. The raw gratitude, the awe, the fierce, possessive wonder in his gaze was a vow stronger than any words. He had been on the brink of oblivion, and she had pulled him back. And then his gaze shifted, looking past her, his eyes hardening to chips of ice. Isolde followed his line of sight. Lord Kyle stood at the edge of the circle, his face pale with fury and something else, a dawning, terrifying understanding. But he was not the one who held the king's attention. It was a group of elders behind him, their faces cloaked in shadow, their sense sharp with a conspiracy that was suddenly, sickeningly clear. Auric rose to his feet, pulling Isolde up with him, his arm a band of iron around her waist, holding her tight against his side. He looked at the elders, his voice a low, lethal growl that carried across the entire courtyard. "Treason," he snarled, the single word a death sentence. "You knew. You have always known what the prophecy of the bleeding moon required, and you chose to let me suffer." The word treason fell like a headsman's axe in the frozen courtyard. The murmurs of the pack died, replaced by a shocked, indrawn breath. All eyes swung from their king to the cluster of elders he had accused. Under the eerie crimson light of the bleoping moon, their shadowed faces seemed to twist into masks of guilt. Lord Kale turned, his own expression one of stunned confusion. "My king, what are you saying? The prophecy was a lie," Auric bit out, his voice laced with the venom of a 2-decade-long betrayal. His arm tightened around Isolde's waist, a possessive, protective gesture that was not lost on anyone present. He was claiming her, shielding her, declaring her his in the face of all challenges. "Or rather, an incomplete truth, fed to me my entire life. Isn't that right, Elder Maeve?" He directed his question to the oldest of the group, a withered she-wolf whose face was a roadmap of ancient secrets. Her scent was of dust and dried leaves and a faint, sour undertone of deceit. She met the king's silver gaze, and for a moment her composure held, then it crumbled. "We did what we thought was necessary for the stability of the pack," she rasped, her voice thin and brittle. "The full prophecy was dangerous. It spoke of a mate born of fire and ash, one who walked with a foot in the spirit world. A creature of shadow. It foretold that such a mate would not just break the curse, but remake the bloodline." A wave of understanding and horror washed over the courtyard. Remake the bloodline. To the conservative elders, steeped in tradition and fearful of change, those words were not a promise, but a threat. "You feared a change in power," Auric said, the realization dawning with chilling clarity. "You feared a mate who would not be a simple, pliable Luna, but a force of nature in her own right. You saw her description in the ancient texts and chose to interpret fire and ash as a symbol of destruction, not purification." His gaze swept over the crowd, his voice rising in power, the voice of a king betrayed. "You let me believe I was simply cursed. You never told me the curse had a key. You let me suffer, let the kingdom weaken, all to maintain your own grip on the traditions that keep you in power." "You saw her," he snarled, his eyes finding Isolde's, filled with a furious, protective light. "And you saw not a savior, but an end to your era. You would have let me die before you let me find her." The accusation hung in the air, irrefutable. The silence that followed was one of judgment. The pack, who had moments before been ready to condemn Isolde as a witch, now turned their suspicious gazes on the elders who had guided them for generations. Their loyalty, first and foremost, was to their alpha. His pain was their pain, and the revelation that it had been willfully prolonged was a betrayal of them all. Isolde stood pressed against Auric's side, trembling not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming force of the moment. The energy still humming between them was a palpable thing, a warm, steady current. She could feel the rage coiling in his muscles, the thunderous beat of his heart against her arm. He was a volcano on the verge of eruption, and she was the only thing holding him to the earth. She reached up her free hand and laid it on his bare chest, over his heart. Her touch was a silent plea for restraint. His skin was hot, the muscles beneath it hard as stone. He flinched at her touch, not in pain, but in surprise. He looked down at her, the crimson fury in his eyes softening as he met her gaze. He saw no fear there, only a steady, quiet strength that mirrored his own. A partnership, an alliance forged in fire and moonlight. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the rage receding from a killing boil to a controlled, lethal simmer. His wolf was still close, but it was no longer a mindless beast. It was his now, fully integrated, listening to its mate. "Guards!" Auric commanded, his voice cold as the grave. Take them, all of them, confine them to the shadow cells. They will await my judgment at sunrise." The royal guard, who had been frozen in indecision, now moved with swift, brutal efficiency. They surged forward, their loyalty to their Alpha Absolute. The accused elders did not resist. Their faces were ashen, their power broken. As they were led away, Maeve cast one last venomous look at Isolde. It was a look that promised that this was not over. With the traitors removed, Auric turned his attention to the rest of the pack. He stood before them, bare-chested and bloodied, with the broken Omega held firmly at his side. He was no longer just their cursed king. He was their Alpha, reborn under the bleeding moon, with his fated mate beside him. "You have been led by fear and lies," he announced, his voice ringing with a new, unshakable authority. "That era is over. This is Isolde. She is not a curse, she is the cure. She is not a witch, she is a gift from the moon herself. She is your Luna." The title fell upon Isolde with the weight of a crown. Luna. It was impossible. She was an Omega, scarred and broken, from a disgraced bloodline. She was the lowest of the low, and he had just named her the highest of the high. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The pack stared, their faces a sea of conflicting emotions: shock, awe, disbelief, and for some, a dawning hope. They had witnessed the miracle. They had seen her tame the Alpha's madness with a single touch. They had heard the Elder's confession. The old world was crumbling before their very eyes. Auric saw their hesitation. He knew that a declaration was not enough. He had to show them. He had to bind her to him in a way that no one could ever question. He turned to face Isolde, cupping her face in his large, blood-stained hands. The world narrowed to the space between them. The pack, the keep, the cold, it all faded away. There was only the intense silver of his eyes and the steady, powerful thrum of his presence. "Isolde Valen," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble meant only for her. Yet it carried to every corner of the silent courtyard. "You came to me in ash, and you gave me air. You came to me in silence, and you gave me a voice. You walked into my darkness, and you brought the moon with you." Tears streamed unheeded from Isolde's good eye. The poetry of his words, the raw, beautiful truth in them, cracked open the last of her defenses. "My wolf knew you the moment you entered my hall," he continued, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "It called to you then, and it calls to you now. It will call for you for all the nights of my life." He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers, just as she had done for him. "Will you answer?" It was not a command. It was not a king's decree. It was a question, a plea from a man's soul to her own. He was giving her a choice, a thing no one had ever offered her before. Her wolf, now wide awake and singing in her blood, gave the answer before she could. A sense of rightness, of destiny, of coming home, washed through her. There was no other path. There never had been. "Yes," she breathed, the word a vow, a prayer, a surrender. A slow, breathtaking smile transformed Auric's face. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it was like watching the sun rise over a winter landscape. It erased the years of pain and solitude, revealing the man he was always meant to be. He lowered his head, and this time, there was no hesitation. This time, there was no pulling back. His lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a cataclysm. It was 20 years of starvation and a lifetime of loneliness unleashed in a single, desperate, claiming touch. It was fire and ice, moonlight and shadow, a collision of two broken souls forging themselves into something new and whole. The power that had arced between them before now exploded, a nova of silver light that pulsed out from them, washing over the entire courtyard. Every member of the pack felt it. A jolt, a surge of pure, unadulterated alpha power, but it was different now. It was no longer the sharp, lonely power of their king. It was a deeper, more resonant energy, rounded and balanced, imbued with the quiet, steady strength of his Luna, the mating bond. It snapped into place with the force of a physical event, a visible, tangible thing that every shifter present could feel in their bones. They were no longer just a king and his Omega. They were a matched pair, an Alpha and a Luna, bound by the goddess and forged under the bleeding moon. A single wolf, a young warrior at the front. was the first to break the stunned silence. He dropped to one knee and lowered his head. Then another followed, and another, until the entire courtyard was filled with the silent, profound gesture of submission and acceptance. They knelt before their king and before the broken Omega, who had become their queen. Auric broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily. The red light of the moon was fading, giving way to the soft silver-white glow of the coming dawn. "It is done," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He looked out over his kneeling pack, and then his gaze returned to her, full of a love so fierce and profound it took her breath away. But as he looked at her, a strange, troubled expression crossed his face. He reached up and gently touched the scar at her temple. The elders, they mentioned the prophecy spoke of remaking the bloodline. What did they mean? Isolde looked up at him, a dawning, terrifying thought beginning to form in her own mind. The fire had not just burned away her scent, the power that had exploded from that forbidden ritual. What if it had done more? What if it had left something behind? As if in answer, she felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth deep within her belly. A flicker of silver light, the same light of their bond, echoed in the core of her being. It was a sensation she had never felt before, a place within her that had always been cold and empty. The healers had called her barren, a broken vessel. Beneath the light of the new dawn, with her alpha's hand on her face and his entire pack kneeling at her feet, Isolde realized with a jolt of terror and wonder that they and the traitorous elders had all been wrong. The prophecy wasn't just about breaking a curse. It was about starting a new legacy. The dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and pale gold, chasing the last vestiges of the bleeding moon from the heavens. The courtyard was bathed in the clean, hopeful light of a new day. Auric stood with Isolde at his side, his pack still kneeling before them. A silent, powerful tableau of a world irrevocably changed. The bond between them was a living thing, a warm, thrumming presence that settled deep in Isolde's bones, chasing away the last of the old chill. It was a shield, an anchor, and a promise. He felt her subtle shift in awareness, saw the dawning wonder and fear in her eyes as she processed the new warmth within her. He didn't need words to understand. The bond was a bridge between their souls, her shock, her tentative hope. It all flowed into him. The prophecy, remake the bloodline. It wasn't about changing their nature, but about restarting it. About life, where for so long there had only been a slow, creeping death. "Rise," Auric commanded, his voice imbued with a new resonance, the balanced power of a mated alpha. The pack rose as one, their faces filled with awe. They were looking at their Luna, not as the broken Omega she had been, but as the miracle she was. Auric's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together. "The judgment of the elders will wait. First, the Luna must be robed." His gaze fell on Lord Kael, who stood apart, his face a complex mask of shame, relief, and dawning loyalty. He had been wrong, and he knew it. He had seen only the threat, not the salvation. "Kael," Auric said, his voice hard, but not entirely unforgiving. "See to it. The finest silks, the warmest furs, nothing is to be denied her." "Yes, Your Majesty," Kael said, bowing low, his voice thick with emotion. He finally looked at Isolde, his gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with a profound, grudging respect. He had witnessed the impossible. He had seen her walk into the heart of a storm that would have destroyed any other and calm it with a touch. He bowed to her as well, a deep, formal acknowledgement of her new station. "My Luna." As Kael hurried to carry out his orders, Auric led Isolde back into the keep. They walked not through the hidden servant passages, but through the main halls. The pack parted before them like a river around a stone, their heads bowed. Whispers followed them, but they were no longer cruel. They were hushed, reverent. The moon's chosen, she who breathes. The fire touched Luna. He did not take her back to his Spartan chambers, but to a suite of rooms that had been sealed for a generation, the Luna's quarters. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light that pierced the heavy velvet curtains. The rooms were opulent, filled with beautifully carved furniture, woven tapestries, and the faint, ghostly scent of the last queen, Auric's mother. It was a place of ghosts, a shrine to a life he had never been allowed to have. As servants bustled in, opening curtains, lighting fires, and bringing in chests of exquisite gowns under Alara's watchful eye. Auric led Isolde to a balcony overlooking the snow-dusted mountains. The morning air was crisp and cold, but she didn't feel it. The warmth of the bond, the heat from his hand holding hers, was a furnace within her. "I never thought I would stand here with anyone," he murmured, his gaze on the distant peaks. This was her favorite view. "Your mother?" Isolde asked softly. He nodded, a shadow of old grief passing over his face. "She died not long after the curse fully manifested. The healers said it was a fever, but I know the truth. She was a Luna without an Alpha. My father was dead, and I could not be near her, or any of them. The heart of the pack was broken. A Luna cannot thrive without her pack, without her mate. She faded. This place, it holds her memory." Isolde squeezed his hand. She understood. She, who had been without a pack, without a place for so long, knew the soul-deep ache of that kind of loneliness. "She would be proud of you, Auric." He turned to look at her, a small, sad smile on his lips. "She would have loved you." The simple, heartfelt words were a gift more precious than any crown. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a kiss of reverence, of gratitude, of promises yet to be kept. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Alara. "My king, my Luna, the council has been assembled. They await your judgment in the throne room." Auric's expression hardened. The peace of the morning was over. It was time to solidify their new reality, to excise the poison that had festered in the heart of his kingdom for so long. "Stay here," he told Isolde. "This is my duty." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. His eyes widened in surprise. The Omega he had met less than a day ago would have cowered from such a confrontation. But she was not that Omega anymore. "You named me Luna, the pack's heart. Their well-being is my duty too. The betrayal was against us both. I will stand with you." A fierce pride blazed in his eyes. He had not chosen a timid consort. He had found his queen. He nodded slowly. "As you will, my love, as you will." When they entered the great hall, it was to a different reception. The room was packed, but the air was not thick with fear and contempt. It was charged with anticipation. Isolde walked at Auric's side, not behind him. She wore a deep emerald gown that Alara had found, the rich color making her pale skin and dark hair seem luminous. She held her head high, her scarred face not a mark of shame, but a testament to the fire she had survived. Her one good eye was clear and steady. The traitorous elders, led by Maeve, were forced to their knees before the throne. Their faces were gray with fear and defeat. Auric and Isolde did not ascend the dais together. He stopped at the bottom step and looked at her. In a gesture that stunned the entire court, he took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and then gestured for her to ascend ahead of him. He was showing his pack that she was not his possession, but his partner, his equal. She walked up the steps and turned, standing beside the great, gnarled ironwood throne. Auric followed, taking his seat, but he did not lean back. He sat on the edge, his body angled toward her, his hand resting on the arm of the throne nearest to her. A silent, constant connection. "Elder Maeve," Auric's voice was like the cracking of a glacier, cold and inexorable. "You stand accused of high treason, of conspiring to withhold the full truth of the moon's prophecy, thereby willfully prolonging the suffering of your alpha, and endangering the future of this kingdom. How do you plead?" Maeve lifted her chin, a last spark of defiant pride in her rheumy eyes. "I plead loyalty to the old ways. We saw what the prophecy foretold, a remaking. A dilution of the pure alpha blood that has ruled for 1,000 years. This creature," she spat, her gaze flicking to Isolde with pure hatred, "is an anomaly, a half-breed of magic and wolf. To allow her to produce an heir is to invite chaos, to destroy everything our ancestors built." A low, dangerous growl rumbled in Auric's chest. He started to rise, his wolf instincts roaring to the surface to defend his mate's honor, but Isolde placed a hand on his arm. The touch was calming, steadying. He settled back into his throne, but his silver eyes promised death. Isolde stepped forward. The hall fell silent. "You speak of the old ways, Maeve," she said, her voice clear and carrying, with no trace of the timid whisper it had once been. "But you forget the oldest way of all, the bond between the moon and her children. You saw prophecy and chose to fear it. You saw a child scarred by fire and chose to call her broken. You looked upon your king's suffering and chose to call it stability. That is not loyalty, it is cowardice. She walked down the steps until she stood directly before the kneeling elder. You speak of my blood, let me tell you of it. I carry the fire that could have destroyed me. I carry the shame of a pack that fell to darkness. I carry the pain of a life spent in the shadows, and I survived it all. My blood is not a dilution, it is a refinement, forged in fire, made stronger through suffering. The very things you cast me out for are the things that made me worthy to stand beside him. She looked up at Auric, and the love and strength that flowed between them was a visible force. The moon did not send your king a simple cure. She sent him a partner strong enough to share the weight of his crown. She turned her gaze back to the stunned pack. Your old ways led you to stagnation and fear. Auric and I offer you a new way, a future built not on brittle traditions, but on the unbreakable strength of a true bond. A pack that heals its weakest members instead of casting them out. A kingdom that is not afraid of change, but embraces it. Her words washed over them, a balm and a challenge. She was not just a consort, she was a leader. She looked down at Maeve one last time. Your sentence is not for us to decide. It is for the pack you betrayed. Auric rose, his eyes blazing with pride for his mate. You have heard the Luna! What say you? He boomed. A warrior near the front, the same one who had knelt first in the courtyard, drew his blade. The old wood is rotten, he shouted. It must be cleared to make way for new growth. I say exile. Exile, another voice roared. Soon the call was taken up by dozens, then hundreds. It was a roar for a new beginning, a casting out of the old fears and the old betrayals. Maeve and the other traitors were dragged away, their power gone, their future a barren wasteland in the harsh northern wilds. As they left, Lord Kael stepped forward and knelt at the foot of the dais, his head bowed. My king, my Luna, my eyes were blinded by fear and tradition. I failed you both. My life is yours to command. Auric looked at Isolde. She gave a slight nod. Mercy was as much a part of strength as wrath. Rise, Lord Kael, Auric said. Your loyalty was to the throne, and it was misplaced. Place it now in us, your Alpha and your Luna, and your counsel will be valued. Kael rose, a look of profound, unwavering loyalty on his face. The last crack in the foundation of their rule had been sealed. Later that day, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountains, Auric and Isolde stood on the balcony once more. The keep was alive with a new energy, a feeling of hope and purpose it had not known for decades. Auric pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn to bruised purple and deep indigo. You were magnificent, he murmured into her hair. You are more of a queen than any pure-blooded female I have ever known. She leaned into his strength, her heart full. I only spoke the truth that you showed me. He turned her in his arms to face him. He looked down at her, his silver eyes soft in the twilight. There is one last thing, a final ritual to make this real, not for the pack or the council, but for us, for our souls. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a single sharp shard of obsidian, the mating mark, to bind us body and soul now and forever. Isolde met his gaze without flinching. Her wolf rose to the surface, eager, ready. She had no ear, not with him. Then let it be done, she whispered. Bind me to you, Auric, now and forever. 1 year later, the air on the high balcony was not cold, but soft with the scent of thawing earth and the promise of mountain blossoms. Spring had come to the north, a gentle, persistent season that seemed to mirror the changes within the keep itself. Below, the courtyard was no longer a place of fear and judgment, but one of activity and life. The sounds of the blacksmith's hammer rang sharp and clear, children's laughter echoed from the training grounds, and the scent of baking bread drifted up from the kitchens. It was the sound of a pack at peace, a kingdom breathing again. Isolde leaned back against the solid warmth of Auric's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her waist. She wore a simple gown of deep blue, but over it was a cloak of shadow wolf fur, the same one he had first given her, now a familiar comfort. He nuzzled the side of her neck, his breath warm against her skin. His touch, once a terrifying impossibility, was now as natural and necessary as the air she breathed. "Lord Kale believes you are a sorceress," Auric murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "He says you have bewitched the southern trade lords. They folded on their tariff demands after a single dinner." A small smile touched Isolde's lips. "I only asked after their children and complimented their steel. They were so surprised Aluna would speak to them directly, they forgot what they were angry about." Auric chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated through her. It was a sound she had come to cherish, a sound the keep had been starved of for decades. "So, sorcery then. Kyle is right." She turned in his arms, her hands coming to rest on the hard planes of his chest. The past year had settled on him like a comfortable mantle. The grim lines of pain around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence. The haunted silver glow of his eyes was still there, but it was no longer a mark of his curse, but simply the luminous gaze of the man she loved. "And what of the pack?" she asked, tracing the line of a faded scar above his heart. "What do they whisper of their Luna now?" "They whisper that you have the wisdom of the mountain and the tenacity of the frost flower that blooms in the snow," he said, his expression serious now, his gaze full of a reverence that still made her heart ache. "They say you healed their king. They are not wrong." The pack's acceptance had not been instantaneous, but it had been absolute. Her quiet strength, her fairness in settling disputes, her habit of walking among them rather than above them, it had won them over completely. They no longer saw her scars. They saw the fire she had survived. They saw the Luna who had given them back their alpha. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the silvery, crescent moon-shaped scar that now rested just below her collarbone, partially hidden by the neckline of her gown. It was his mating mark. The night he had given it to her, with the sharp edge of obsidian, had not been one of pain, but of profound connection. As his blood had sealed the mark, their bond had settled into its final, unbreakable form. It was a part of her now, a faint, glowing reminder of the moment their souls had been permanently entwined. His own mark, a mirror of hers, was over his heart. "Maeve and the others did not survive the winter in the Barrens," he said quietly, his gaze distant for a moment. "The northern wilds deliver their own justice. Their fear was a poison they ended up drinking themselves." It was a grim thought, but a necessary closure. Their betrayal had been a cancer in the pack, and it had been excised. Now new growth was possible. Isolde laid her head against his chest, listening to the steady, even rhythm of his heart. It was her favorite sound, the proof of the miracle they lived every day. For 20 years, this heart had beat in a cage of silence and agony. Now, it beat for her. She felt his body tense slightly. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his brow furrowed. His gaze was searching, his alpha senses, always keenly attuned to her, picking up on something new. He had been this way for weeks, watching her with a strange, intense concentration. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Your scent," he murmured, his head dipping lower, his nose brushing against the pulse point at the base of her throat. He inhaled deeply. "It is changing." Her breath hitched. She had noticed it too, a subtle shift in the air around her. Her usual scent of old ashes and soothing salves had been joined by something new, something faint but undeniable, the sweet, clean fragrance of spring rain on new leaves, the scent of life. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the dawning of a wild, impossible hope, the same hope he'd had on that first night, but 100 times more potent, 100 times more terrifying and beautiful. "The prophecy," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Remake the bloodline." Isolde felt a tear slip from her eye. She had been too afraid to believe it, too afraid to voice the suspicion that had been growing within her for the past month. The healers had called her barren, a broken vessel. Her own mind had accepted it as truth, but the bond and the ancient magic of the prophecy had followed a different truth. She took his large, calloused hand and placed it flat against her stomach. She held it there, her own hand covering his. "The fire that took my scent," she whispered, her voice trembling with the enormity of the words. "It did not destroy the garden, my love. It only made the soil lie fallow, waiting for the right season, waiting for you." For a long moment, Auric did not move. He was utterly still, a statue carved from disbelief and awe. He stared down at their joined hands on her belly, as if he could see through skin and bone to the secret she had just revealed. He felt it then, not just with his hand, but through the bond, a tiny nascent flicker of a new life, a new soul forged from their own, glowing with a soft, silvery light. A shudder racked his entire body. He sank to his knees before her on the cold stone of the balcony, his forehead coming to rest against her stomach. His great shoulders shook with the force of an emotion too vast for words. It was the silent, soul-deep cry of a man who had been condemned to a barren existence and had just been handed the entire world. He was the king who had been cursed to silence, the alpha who could not touch. He had ruled a kingdom of shadows, his only companion the raging of his own wolf. Now he knelt at the feet of his salvation, his queen, his mate. He breathed in her scent, ash and spring rain, sorrow and hope, and felt the promise of his child, their heir, stirring within her. He looked up at her, his silver eyes luminous with tears, shining with a love so powerful it was the new center of the universe. The silence of his past was gone, replaced by the beating of 3 hearts instead of one. His world had found its voice, and it was her name,